This particular section aims at reviewing the fact that food risk analysis process is not a linear process. It is rather an iterative process. We have identified that the food risk analysis is based on risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. We have the tendency of thinking that these different aspects are actually run one after the other. In fact, they are not. Let's not forget that the risk analysis process is initiated by the risk manager. It is the risk manager that is faced with the food safety incident or with the particular standard, the decision that needs to be made in view of a particular issue. So, in fact, the starting point of the process is a component of the risk management process, and generally it is initiated by the risk manager through a number of preliminary activities. These preliminary activities essentially of risk management. So preliminary activities of risk management, generally identifying the issue, so the issue ID, but also through the identification of the issue, framing the different questions that need to be answered, and particularly the questions that require the scientific involvement, the risk assessment. So framing the question is in fact a key consideration in the context of the preliminary risk management activities conducted by the risk manager. In particular, framing the questions for the risk assessors to start their job, trying to answer the potential risks associated with the incident, the potential risks associated with the situation that may warrant the development of a regulatory measure or a particular standard. From here, we generally move to the component of the risk assessment, which starts obviously by looking at the hazard and looking specifically at the hazard identification, what it is that potentially causes harm. Obviously, it's not enough to identify the hazards, but also to characterize it. So here we have the hazard characterization pieces. So looking, for example, at the dose response, at what dose are we potentially creating harm, or at what dose are we potentially not having any potential health effect. Also, after the hazard identification, we will be looking at potential exposure issue, how much of the hazard is present and how much of the hazard is potentially consumed through the consumption of food. So how much the consumer is exposed to. And in this particular case, we have the exposure assessment approach. So these pieces, the hazard characterization and the exposure assessment, together lead to the risk characterization. And the risk characterization conclusion should be, in fact, an answer to the question that was framed by the risk manager. So this is, in fact, the answer of the question that we are looking at. In fact, the entirety of this process from hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, and risk characterization is in fact the entire risk assessment process. So this is in fact the risk assessment component of the risk analysis approach. From there, from the risk characterization element, obviously here, what happens is the risk manager is provided with the answer, and the risk manager is therefore looking at an evaluation of the risk. So in fact, here we have risk evaluation that is provided to the risk manager. This risk evaluation is mostly a scientific assessment outlining a response to the question that was framed by the risk manager and generally answering how much of a risk are we faced with or are consumers faced with, what type of subpopulation might be most vulnerable, for example, what is the characteristics of this risk, is it an acute risk, is it a chronic risk, what are the potential repercussions, and so on. So essentially those, of course, are answers provided in response to the way the question is being framed. As a result of this risk evaluation, then the risk manager adds a number of other considerations, particularly some economic considerations, some social, cultural considerations, maybe political considerations, and in this context starts developing the options for risk management. So essentially, it's the assessment of the different options and the selection of these different options. So options assessment and selection. From there, once the options have been assessed and selected, obviously one or a few might be identified as worthy to pursue. Then we have an implementation of these options implementation. Of course, once we have conducted that, it is customary to evaluate the effectiveness of whatever measure and whatever option has been chosen. So after this, we will have a monitoring or a review of the process. Once we do that monitoring and a review, it is not it's not rare to identify that as a result of this monitoring and review, that there are some new issues that are identified. Generally, by the way, the monitoring and the review are conducted a number of years after the option was implemented. When I say the option has been implemented, it could be a standard, it could be a regulatory measure, it could be a non-regulatory measure, such as, for example, education of consumers, education of industry, voluntary programs. In the context of an incident management, it could be a recall of a product or a set of products. It could be advice to consumers and other type of risk management measures. Of course, after that, you have to monitor the effectiveness and to review what was decided. And depending, of course, on the issue, the timelines can be several years for if the measure is a standard or a regulatory decision. It could be several weeks or a couple of months if it is in the context of an incident management, like looking at the effectiveness of a recall or the effectiveness of a communication to consumers or an education process to industry. As a result of that, it's not rare to identify new issues that need to be addressed, which actually will lead again to re-kicking the process of the preliminary evaluation and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that it is very important to mention is while all this is being conducted, and by the way, this second part of the process that is before us here, the second part in this particular area, this part is in fact the risk management component. So this is the risk management component. And you see that in fact there is definitely an interaction between the risk management and the risk assessment component, even though each part is conducted quite separately. Now, this will not be successful unless there is regular exchange and communication between those who are in charge, so the competent authorities, as well as with the community that might be impacted by the decisions, whether be it essentially consumers, whether be it industry, whether it is non-government organization, etc. So this particular part, obviously, any interested party, in fact, so this particular part is the risk communication component that we have. So this part is the risk communication. And obviously, there is, and I put the arrows in both ways, there is definitely an exchange throughout this process, both throughout the risk assessment and the risk management. And this is obviously the risk communication part of the risk analysis. So I hope that through this demonstration, you have arrived at the conclusion that the risk analysis process is not linear, that it does not go like we always say, risk assessment, risk management, risk communication, that it is iterative, and that you see also the roles and the responsibilities of the different parties, as well as the sequence of events that is pursued in this particular case.